Number 1.
On May 12, 1932, the tiny body of one-year-old Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was discovered in the woods outside of Trenton, New Jersey. The coroner's report stated that the child had been dead for over 2 months. The child's skull had a hole in it, as well as several other fractures, and the coroner ruled the cause of death as a blow to the head. Several of the baby's body parts were also missing. The Lindbergh baby, the son of Spirit of St. Louis pilot Charles Lindbergh Sr., had been missing for roughly 3 months after being kidnapped from his crib at the Lindbergh home. The child had been put to bed by the nurse at 7:30 p.m. 2 hours later, Lindbergh Sr. heard a noise coming from that he assumed to be a wooden crate, snapping in the kitchen. At 10 p.m., the nurse discovered that the child's crib was empty. After discovering that the child was not with the nurse or with his mother, Lindbergh Sr. discovered a ransom note on the windowsill and a broken ladder outside the window. After reading the note, Lindbergh Sr. fruitlessly searched the house and the grounds before calling the police. For 3 months, the Lindbergh family, along with the FBI, searched for the child, even fulfilling an enormous ransom request and interviewing countless suspects and witnesses. In the end, the official culprit named was Richard Hauptmann, an immigrant from Germany who had a criminal record back in his homeland. Police discovered Hauptmann in possession of $14,000 of the original $50,000 used to pay the ransom after tracking him through one of the $10 bills he had spent at a local gas station. Hauptmann was arrested and charged with capital murder of the Lindbergh baby, a charge that allowed the death penalty as a possible option. The trial was dubbed the trial of the century, with one reporter even claiming it was the biggest story since the resurrection. As big as the trial was, the jury was surprisingly quick to return a guilty verdict. He was immediately sentenced to death, and his 2 requests for appeal were both denied. On April 3, 1936, 4 years after the kidnapping, Richard Hauptmann was executed via electric chair. Though the case seemed open and shut on paper, the investigation was far from. Between the media frenzy, the mysterious ransom letters, and the numerous side investigations happening, it's a miracle anyone was convicted. When the Lindbergh baby kidnapping was first reported, hundreds of loyal Lindbergh fans and concerned citizens descended upon the Lindbergh estate. While the media attention helped to boost the case and help spread the word about the missing toddler, the high levels of traffic on the estate effectively destroyed any footprint evidence that might have been found outside the home. It also encouraged hundreds of false reports of sightings and information. Military officials and investigators all offered their services, claiming to have expertise in kidnappings and law enforcement. However, only one of them truly did. Herbert Norman Schwarzkopf, superintendent of the New Jersey State Police Department, along with Lindbergh, theorized that the Lindbergh kidnapping was part of an organized crime ring rather than a single perpetrator seeking the ransom money. Following that lead, they reached out to mobsters, both in and out of prison, hoping one of them would have information on the Lindbergh baby. Al Capone himself even reached out to Lindbergh, offering his services in exchange for an early prison release, though he was quickly denied. Similarly, it was decided that mobsters were likely to be less than helpful when it came to offering up information for free. Due to the media circus and the high profile of Lindbergh, President Herbert Hoover was notified of the kidnapping the morning after it happened. Though kidnappings were usually dealt with among local authorities, Hoover assigned the entire Bureau of Investigation, not yet federal, to the case and authorized them to work with the New Jersey police. As a reward for information pertaining to Charles Lindbergh Jr.'s case, the police department offered up $25,000. In addition, the Lindbergh family offered another $50,000 of their own. While the New Jersey police were investigating alongside the Lindbergh family, a retired New York school teacher was also taking an interest in the Lindbergh baby case. John F. Camden, who was at the time a well-known personality in the Bronx, wrote a letter to a local newspaper, offering a reward of $1,000 if the kidnapper would return little Lindy to a Catholic priest. Surprisingly, Camden received a letter back from people claiming to be the kidnappers, asking Camden to be their intermediary between them and Lindbergh. Lindbergh, desperate to find his son, agreed, allowing Camden to fulfill the letter's request. Camden placed a classified ad in another newspaper and arranged a meeting with one of the kidnappers to take place in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. The meeting did indeed take place, though under cover of darkness, so the culprit's face was never clearly seen. However, the man said his name was John and claimed he was part of an escaped Scandinavian gang. He claimed to have the toddler in his possession in a boat off the coast and would return it for the ransom. When Camden doubted the man's story, the man promised to return the baby's pajamas. Indeed, a few weeks later, Camden received a toddler's sleeping suit in the mail. Lindbergh confirmed that the pajamas were his son's and asked Camden to continue communicating with the kidnappers and fulfilling their requests. Over the course of the Lindbergh kidnapping investigation, the Lindberghs and Camden received a total of 7 ransom letters. The first was found by Charles in his son's room immediately after discovering the boy was gone. It outlined the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and asked for $50,000 to be delivered to a yet undisclosed location in small bills. The first note was signed with a signature, a hand-drawn symbol comprised of 3 circles and 3 punched-out holes. The second and third notes, delivered to the Lindbergh home and local investigators, carried the same symbols. The rest of the notes were delivered to Camden and did not carry the notes, though their authenticity was confirmed. After the delivery of the 7th note, the Lindberghs and the police authorized Camden to orchestrate a drop-off of the funds. The ransom money was comprised of gold certificates, chosen because they were about to be withdrawn from circulation, placed inside a handmade box, specifically designed so that it would be easy to recognize in the future. The bills were not marked, but each bill's serial number was recorded, so it could be tracked in the future. Camden met with John on April 2, 1932, to hand over the money. He was told at the meeting that Charles Lindbergh Jr. was in the custody of 2 innocent women, but provided no further information. Having no leads besides Cemetery John, the police began tracking the serial numbers of the ransom bills. A pamphlet was distributed to businesses in New York containing the serial numbers and providing information for what to do if they were found. Some of the bills turned up, though most went unseen. Most of the bills that appeared showed up randomly and in scattered locations such as Chicago and Minneapolis, though the people who had used them were never located. A break in the case came on the day that the gold certificates, which made up a large sum of the ransom, were ordered to be turned in for other bills. A New York man brought $2,980 into a Manhattan bank, hoping to exchange them. It was only after he left the bank that it was discovered that the serial numbers matched those of the ransom bills. Over a period of 30 months, police noticed that many of the bills had started popping up, specifically in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Even more specifically, they were being spent along the Lexington Avenue subway route. After a local gas station called and said they had one of the ransom bills in their possession, police were led to Richard Hauptmann. Though Hauptmann is considered the official kidnapper of Charles Lindbergh Jr., that hasn't stopped conspiracy theorists from coming up with their own version of what actually happened during the Lindbergh kidnapping. Defenders of Hauptmann's are quick to point out that his fingerprints were never found on the latter or any of the ransom notes. They also attest to the fact that the crime scene was a mess from the start and that any evidence available was quickly compromised by the media circus it became. Some experts, both self-proclaimed and legitimate, have theorized that Hauptmann was a scapegoat and that Lindbergh knew who the real kidnapper was but was either in on it or too afraid to say anything. In fact, one of the most popular, and some might say substantiated claims is that the kidnapping was perpetrated by Charles Lindbergh himself. Some say that he accidentally killed his son while attempting a practical joke and staged the kidnapping to cover up his crimes, pointing the finger at Hauptmann to cover his own deeds. Some believe that Lindbergh orchestrated the kidnapping as a publicity stunt and that after the hired kidnappers didn't get whatever it was Lindbergh had promised them, the stunt went horribly wrong. Lindbergh, his family, and the New Jersey police have argued against the theories that he was responsible for the kidnapping, insisting that everything they knew about the case suggested it had been legitimate and that the toddler's death was simply the result of the kidnapper snapping under pressure. Whatever the case, though it is closed, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping has become one of the most controversial and conspiratorial cases to ever be discussed by the American public. Outside of pop culture and media, the case broke ground when it pushed Congress to pass the Federal Kidnapping Act, which made transporting a kidnapping victim across state lines a federal offense. The law is commonly referred to as the Lindbergh Law.
Number 2.
On the morning of January 12, 1984, 7-year-old Gary Grant Jr. told his mom, May, he had an appointment that day. That was the last time he was seen alive. Gary Jr. left home around noon. While it was an odd choice of words, his mom just assumed her was being a silly kid, saying he had an appointment. She thought he was just meeting up with his friends. When she asked who it was with, the boy replied that it was a secret. Gary Jr. told his mom that he would be back home around 4 that afternoon. His parents had been separated for a year and he lived with his mom. At 4:30, May began to worry since Gary Jr. wasn't home yet. So she went down the street to the friend's home she thought he was at only to discover that they hadn't seen him. At 6 p.m., with no sign of her son, she called her husband at work. Gary Grant Sr. was a police officer with the Atlantic City Police Department. Gary Sr. left work to immediately start searching for his son. By the next morning, Atlantic City Police were also searching for the boy. 2 blocks from the Grant's home, Robert Huey owned a warehouse. He told authorities that he saw the boy around 4:30 p.m. near the warehouse and he was headed toward his home. Kids were regularly seen around the warehouse, so it wasn't anything new. There was a park nearby that the kids frequented. 2 days later, Robert Huey was searching around his warehouse and found the body of Gary Jr. The boy had been beaten. What's even more tragic is that before the family could be notified of the discovery, they came across the scene where the body was found. Immediately, police began talking with everyone Gary Jr. knew or could have come into contact with. This is when police came across Carl Boo Mason, who was a mentally challenged 12-year-old. Boo was smaller than Gary, but the 2 boys were friends. Even though he said he wasn't with Gary that day, police kept coming back to question him. Eventually, Boo's grandmother took the boy to the police station where he was separated from her and questioned. His stories had not been consistent, and after 3 hours police determined that they had a confession from the child. They arrested Boo, but he was released 1 month later. He said that the confession was coerced. Over the years, he is still the only named suspect, but was never arrested again. Did the killer leave messages? 2 years after the murder of Gary Grant Jr., on January 4, 1986, a message was left on an Atlantic City police car. The message read, "Gary Grant's dead. I am living. Another will die on January 12 if all goes right." January 12, 1986 would be the 2-year anniversary of the boy's murder. Just a few weeks after the patrol car was vandalized, another message was found carved into a sidewalk. This message was, "Gary Grant Jr. lives. I still killed him. Son of a pig officer. Payback is a MF." Due to these messages, police started to feel that the boy had been killed as retaliation against his father Gary Sr. They started looking back through his cases and convictions, but didn't find anything that would cause this type of reaction from someone he arrested. By 2015, Gary Sr. was retired and still looking into his son's case in the hope of finding the killer. While he was going through boxes of evidence, he came across an audio clip that he had never heard before. This clip was a 911 call that came in on what would have been Gary Jr.'s 10th birthday. Another recording was found that came in on June 2, 1986. While there is another suspect known to Gary Sr. and prosecutors, he still believes that Carl Boo Mason is responsible for his son's death. However, he also says that it is possible that he may not be. The man that is the other suspect was arrested in 2013 for molesting a young child. At the time of the murder, this man lived in a neighborhood that Gary Sr. patrolled, but there were no issues between the 2 men. It's never been determined if he has any connection to Gary Jr.'s murder. Gary Grant Jr.'s family has never given up hope that they will get justice. If you have any information regarding the murder of Gary Grant Jr., please call the Atlantic City Prosecutor's Office at 609-909-7800 or Crime Stoppers at 800-658-8477.
Number 3.
On the morning of January 12, 1984, 7-year-old Gary Grant Jr. told his mom, May, he had an appointment that day. That was the last time he was seen alive. Gary Jr. left home around noon. While it was an odd choice of words, his mom just assumed her was being a silly kid, saying he had an appointment. She thought he was just meeting up with his friends. When she asked who it was with, the boy replied that it was a secret. Gary Jr. told his mom that he would be back home around 4 that afternoon. His parents had been separated for a year and he lived with his mom. At 4:30, May began to worry since Gary Jr. wasn't home yet. So she went down the street to the friend's home she thought he was at only to discover that they hadn't seen him. At 6 p.m., with no sign of her son, she called her husband at work. Gary Grant Sr. was a police officer with the Atlantic City Police Department. Gary Sr. left work to immediately start searching for his son. By the next morning, Atlantic City Police were also searching for the boy. 2 blocks from the Grant's home, Robert Huey owned a warehouse. He told authorities that he saw the boy around 4:30 p.m. near the warehouse and he was headed toward his home. Kids were regularly seen around the warehouse, so it wasn't anything new. There was a park nearby that the kids frequented. 2 days later, Robert Huey was searching around his warehouse and found the body of Gary Jr. The boy had been beaten. What's even more tragic is that before the family could be notified of the discovery, they came across the scene where the body was found. Immediately, police began talking with everyone Gary Jr. knew or could have come into contact with. This is when police came across Carl Boo Mason, who was a mentally challenged 12-year-old. Boo was smaller than Gary, but the 2 boys were friends. Even though he said he wasn't with Gary that day, police kept coming back to question him. Eventually, Boo's grandmother took the boy to the police station where he was separated from her and questioned. His stories had not been consistent, and after 3 hours police determined that they had a confession from the child. They arrested Boo, but he was released 1 month later. He said that the confession was coerced. Over the years, he is still the only named suspect, but was never arrested again. Did the killer leave messages? 2 years after the murder of Gary Grant Jr., on January 4, 1986, a message was left on an Atlantic City police car. The message read, "Gary Grant's dead. I am living. Another will die on January 12 if all goes right." January 12, 1986 would be the 2-year anniversary of the boy's murder. Just a few weeks after the patrol car was vandalized, another message was found carved into a sidewalk. This message was, "Gary Grant Jr. lives. I still killed him. Son of a pig officer. Payback is at MF." Due to these messages, police started to feel that the boy had been killed as retaliation against his father Gary Sr. They started looking back through his cases and convictions, but didn't find anything that would cause this type of reaction from someone he arrested. By 2015, Gary Sr. was retired and still looking into his son's case in the hope of finding the killer. While he was going through boxes of evidence, he came across an audio clip that he had never heard before. This clip was a 911 call that came in on what would have been Gary Jr.'s 10th birthday. Another recording was found that came in on June 2, 1986. While there is another suspect known to Gary Sr. and prosecutors, he still believes that Carl Boo Mason is responsible for his son's death. However, he also says that it is possible that he may not be. The man that is the other suspect was arrested in 2013 for molesting a young child. At the time of the murder, this man lived in a neighborhood that Gary Sr. patrolled, but there were no issues between the 2 men. It's never been determined if he has any connection to Gary Jr.'s murder. Gary Grant Jr.'s family has never given up hope that they will get justice. If you have any information regarding the murder of Gary Grant Jr., please call the Atlantic City Prosecutor's Office at 609-909-7800 or Crime Stoppers at 800-658-8477.
Number 4.
Shooting attacks are terrifying events. Sometimes they come from out of nowhere, and for no apparent reason other than to sow terror, chaos, and death. Yet most of the time at least there is a clear, physical enemy, a villain we can fight back against, or arrest to answer for their crimes. At least we can usually achieve some closure by catching or cutting down the source of the mayhem. However, this is not always the case. In one bizarre incident in the U.S. state of New Jersey, a town was gripped with fear as a mysterious, phantom assailant went on a serial shooting spree, opening fire seemingly at random and leaving behind no clues, evidence, or even bullets, as if both the attacker and his weapon were manifestations of some supernatural force. Beginning in November of 1927, the area of Camden, New Jersey was visited by an enigmatic, seemingly ghostly force that terrorized the populace. In this month, several cars and even a city bus traveling along the Camden Bridge, also called the Federal Street Bridge, had their windshields shattered by what at first seemed to be bullets. In total, 5 vehicles would be shot at in this manner, and it at first seemed to be a straightforward case of gun shootings, yet inspection of the cars revealed no signs of any bullet fragments or shell casings, as if the bullets themselves had simply vanished without a trace. One of the victims of the attacks was none other than former State Senator Albert S. Woodruff. Luckily, none of the passengers of the vehicles were directly hit by a bullet, and the only injuries were from broken glass, but this was not the case with some of the authorities looking into the matter. During an investigation into the mystery, one police officer by the name of John J. Rogers was fired upon twice as he made his way across the bridge, with one of the projectiles hitting him directly in the back, hard enough to cause him to spin around before falling to the ground reeling in pain. In this case, the guilty projectile was found, and oddly turned out to be a blue marble, although no one could figure out how it could have been fired with such spectacular velocity, especially from the distance it was deduced the shot must have traveled, and a thorough house-to-house search of the area as well as meticulous canvassing of the surroundings turned up no sign of a culprit. The shot that had missed was found to have left a considerable dent and chipped paint on the heavy steel railing of the bridge, further illustrating the sheer force which had propelled the marbles. The officer himself escaped with a wicked bruise on his back, but otherwise unsettled, but intact. Despite the discovery of the marble, analysis of the smashed vehicle windshields of the vehicles that had been attacked led to authorities unanimously agreeing that the damage must have been caused by bullets, likely of a .22 or .25 caliber. But from where, and where had they gone? One idea was the shot fired on the city bus had perhaps come from inside the vehicle, but there were no fragments of bullets anywhere, and authorities could not come to an agreement on this matter. The attacks continued as various private automobiles, trolleys, and buses and taxis, as well as electric lights were fired upon by bullets that seemed to disappear. All in all, 11 vehicles were attacked in this manner, and in almost every case witnesses reported hearing no report of a gunshot. Additionally, no sign of any shooter in the afflicted areas could be found, indeed not even a decent vantage point from where such well-placed shots could be fired could be located. Baffled authorities were still trying to figure out what was going on when another series of phantom attacks was carried out, this time in various other locations. At a place called Kramer Hill, a store owned by a Gottlob mayor was assaulted when its plate glass door was penetrated by an unknown missile. An investigation into the attack determined that the projectile had definitely been fired from outside, but no trace of any bullet fragments or sign of any other projectile such as a metal ball bearing, or marble could be found on the premises despite a thorough scouring of every inch of floor, as if it had vanished into thin air. Once again, there was no report of anyone hearing the boom of a gun being fired, and no one from the fire station across the street had heard or seen anything either. Similar phantom attacks were reported from Collingswood and Lindenwood, New Jersey as well, yet in all of the cases no sound of gunfire nor evidence of any bullet could be found, further puzzling authorities. In some of the cases, unconventional projectiles were found at the scene, such as a nickel-plated screw and more marbles, but police were not sure if these were the work of the real phantom sniper or a copycat. For the most part, authorities were completely at a loss as to what was going on. The best guess that anyone could come up with was that someone was using some sort of high-powered air gun or slingshot to carry out the attacks, but this was counter to the amount of damage caused, which seemed very much as if it had come from bullets. Additionally, there was no type of air gun or slingshot known to police at the time that could account for the sheer force with which the projectiles had apparently been fired. Another prevailing theory was that the mystery assailant was using a type of sophisticated silencer. Authorities, desperately searching for answers, were only presented with a very few clues. In one case, police came up with a young boy who they thought may have shot at passing vehicles through a window located not far from the bridge, but there could be found no clue as to how he had projected the missiles with such force, nor how he could have been responsible for the other attacks. In the meantime, the locals were getting increasingly panicked by the phantom shooter, who had not caused any fatalities, but to most it was just a matter of time. It seemed as if the seemingly ghostly shooter could strike at any time and any place, and no one was ever sure if its sights were being set on them at any given moment. People were afraid to go out of their houses, and most avoided the bridge altogether. It is thought that it is this very desperate panic that may have caused copycats to come out of the woodwork to take advantage of the chaos, which further muddies the waters when trying to reach a conclusion on this case. Another possible lead came in the form of a mysterious incident that occurred when a shot pierced the bedroom window of two young women sleeping in their bedroom at around 4:30 a.m. In this case, the victims explained that they had seen a strange man lurking on the street outside their home, who ran away with astonishing speed. One of the victims would say of the situation thus: "We saw a man with a gun standing across the street. He was looking up at our window. As we looked, he broke into a run. He reached the corner and I heard him say to another man, 'It's all right now, Louis.'" The mysterious man was described as being very tall and fleet of foot for his size, easily scampering away into the darkness. It is unknown who the enigmatic Louis may be. In this case, a projectile of sorts was actually found, in the form of a .32 caliber bullet found on the bedroom floor. Even so, police were unable to identify the perpetrator or figure out where the bullet had come from. It could not even be accurately deduced from which direction it had entered the room. The rampant panic of the area continued until suddenly the attacks just suddenly stopped in 1928, leaving authorities no closer to solving the case than they had ever been. The whole incident remains a compelling mystery and is still unexplained. Who was this mysterious shooter and how were they able to so effectively evade police? Indeed, what happened to the bullets, which seemed to be just as spectral as the assailant? This is a bizarre case that still inspires speculation to this day, and no shooter or sign of his phantom bullets have ever been found. It seems that in some cases, shooters can not only come from nowhere, but disappear into nowhere as well.
Number 5.
It was a chilly winter morning on the 17th of December, 1962, when 3-year-old William Ebenezer Jones Jr. was playing with his sister, Jill, outside their Vineland, New Jersey, home. Their mother, Evelyn, periodically watched from the window while looking after her younger son and preparing lunch. William lived on Taylor Avenue with his parents and 2 younger siblings. The family home was decorated for Christmas, which was fast approaching. Underneath the Christmas tree were William's presents, including coloring books and a toy tank. Tragically, young William never got the chance to play with his new toys. Maybe he never got a chance to play with any toys ever again, because on that fateful day, William vanished. It started out like a typical busy pre-holiday day. William's father departed the home that morning to start his shift at the New York Shipbuilding Company in Camden. Evelyn ran some errands in the morning with the children. William got a haircut, and then they stopped at the bank. Upon returning home, William and Jill went to play outside with the family dogs, a basset hound and a collie. While playing outside with his sister, William was wearing a blue-gray snowsuit, a matching hat, and tan high tops with yellow laces. The toddler had bright blue eyes, big ears, and a vaccination scar that was shaped like a giraffe on his upper left arm. William loved dogs, reading and playing with toy cars. He was just 3 months shy of his 4th birthday and had a habit of twisting curls in his hair and walking with a quirky shuffle. At around 11:45 a.m., a neighbor spotted William on his own and suggested that he go back home. Then at 1 p.m., Evelyn heard a knock at the door. She opened the door and was shocked to see only Jill standing in the doorway. Jill, who was only 2 years old at the time, entered the home carrying a plastic potted poinsettia that she told Evelyn she got from William. She also told Evelyn that the bogeyman had taken William. Mrs. Jones rushed from the home and frantically ran up and down the street looking for William. While searching, an unknown man approached Evelyn in his green car and asked, "Are you Mrs. Jones?" Evelyn didn't reply. She didn't know the man and didn't ask for his name or ask why he was looking for her. She continued her search, but when William was nowhere to be seen, he was reported missing by Evelyn. The family's basset hound, Baby, was also missing. However, she was later found a short distance from the home, soaking wet. Meanwhile, neighbors were already searching for him, kicking off a 4-day search which included hundreds of police officers, firefighters, National Guard troops and volunteers alike. All of the area's emergency services were called in, and they trawled through the area on foot, by boat and by air. They searched the woods and swampland in the vicinity of William's home, and Maurice River was searched. 2 Navy helicopters were flown in to scour the area from above. Bloodhounds from Philadelphia were also shipped in, but they lost the scent near the family home. The entire area had already been stomped over and driven over. Unfortunately, the search was unfruitful. There was no sign of William anywhere. The disappearance evoked fear in the city and made national news. Understandably, William's parents couldn't come to terms with his disappearance and moved away from the city shortly afterwards. William's father began to drink and the family didn't speak much about the disappearance at home. As a result of the disappearance, Mr. and Mrs. Jones became extremely overprotective. One early line of investigation was the plastic poinsettia. It became somewhat a cause célèbre in the investigation. There were early reports that somebody had been selling the flowers around the neighborhood shortly before William vanished. However, it was later uncovered that it had simply come from a neighbor's trash and had been passed around by several local children. After learning there was a trash collection in the area between 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m. on the day William disappeared, investigators questioned whether he could have crawled into a trash bin or even whether he could have been killed and thrown into a trash bin. They questioned the trash men who said they hadn't seen the boy and they would have noticed him being emptied into the truck. Nevertheless, investigators went to the landfill to search for any sign of the boy, but to no avail. At one point in the investigation, the Jones family turned to a local psychic who claimed that William was still alive. She told the family that he had been abducted by a man whose wife was having a mental breakdown due to the death of her own toddler son. She theorized that William was taken to an Amish area in Pennsylvania and raised by a new family. However, investigators doubted this theory, stating that William would have memories of his real family and would have informed somebody of his true identity as he got older. However, investigators doubted this theory, stating that William would have memories of his real family and would have informed somebody of his true identity as he got older. In 1964, another local psychic told investigators that William had been struck and killed by somebody who did not intend to harm him. They panicked and then buried William in a nearby area. The psychic gave investigators a description of the man's car and appearance. Years later, Jill would be put under hypnosis in the hopes that she could recount more information about the day her brother disappeared. She recalled holding hands with William as 2 men fought in front of an oil drum fire at the Palace of Depression, a landmark near the family's home. "I remember running, and eventually I could see the door to my house," she said. During the investigation, the Palace of Depression, an attraction built from discarded materials, was extensively searched as it was theorized that William could have wandered in there or could have been hit by a car and disposed of there. In the wake of the disappearance, Jill had dreams about her brother. "It's like he's on the other side of a brick wall, and he's calling me, and I have to find a way to get to him," she said. "I still say I'm going to find him." Over the forthcoming years, age progressions of William have been released showing what he may look like as an adult. Information about William's disappearance was entered into the National Crime Information Center system. His sister provided a DNA sample. Despite hundreds of leads and tips, no body was found, no arrests were made, and no credible sightings have ever been reported. Somebody has to know something. "I really do believe that," said retired Vineland Police Sergeant Patrick Doherty. Until I see a body, I'm not going to rule out that he's alive. It's now generally believed that William was abducted as opposed to wandered off. Despite a lengthy search and extensive investigation, William remains missing. Jill is now the last remaining member of William's immediate family. On top of a cabinet in her home, she has an urn containing the ashes of her mother, father and younger brother. "When someone dies, you know where they're at," she said. But with Billy, you don't have an answer. Anyone with information about Billy Jones' disappearance is asked to call the Vineland Police Department at 856-691-4111.
Number 6.
After being tried, convicted and executed for the triple murder of one of Morristown's most respected families, the story of Antoine Leblanc should have been over. But his public hanging on the town green was really just the beginning of a tale so gruesome that Morristonians still recoil at its telling 160 years after the incident. For it is said that the remains of Antoine Leblanc may rest in pieces, to this day, amongst the treasured family heirlooms in some of the finest homes of New Jersey. Leblanc, a French immigrant by way of Germany, arrived in New York in April of 1833. After 3 days in the New World, he was hired as a hand to work the family farm of Samuel Sayre of Morristown, New Jersey. In exchange for his hog slopping and wood chopping labors, Leblanc was afforded a small room in the dank basement of the Sayre house but no wages. He took his work orders from Mr. Sayre, his wife Sarah, and even the Sayres' household servant Phoebe, who is believed to have been a slave. Being the privileged son of a well-to-do European family, this arrangement probably did not sit too well with the 31-year-old Leblanc. It was about 2 weeks after he first started his menial chores on the Sayre farm that Leblanc decided that he could suffer the indignity no longer. He began to plan his revenge. On the night of May 11, Leblanc returned to the Sayre house at about 10:30 p.m. after drinking at a local tavern. Faking distress, he summoned Samuel Sayre out to the stable, where he said that there was a problem with the horses. Carrying a candle, Mr. Sayre made his way out to the barn, where Leblanc proceeded to smash in his employer's face with a shovel, splattering pieces of Sayre's brain all over his coat. The killer then repeated his ploy on Mrs. Sayre, finishing her off with a kick to the head from one of his heavy boots. After hiding the two bodies beneath the nearby pile of manure, Leblanc made his way back to the main house, where he found Phoebe asleep in her bedroom on the second floor. Leblanc then caved in the unsuspecting girl's skull with a single blow from a club. After his murderous spree, Leblanc frantically stuffed whatever household valuables he could into pillowcases and set off down the road on one of the Sayres' horses. In his haste to escape the scene of the crime, he unknowingly left a trail of stolen booty in the roadway that would later mark his route. On the morning that followed, Louis Halsey, a Sayre family friend, discovered some personal effects in the road which bore the monogram of Samuel Sayre. Fearing a robbery had taken place, a group of townsfolk decided to search the Sayre property. After the grisly discovery of the 3 murdered victims, Sheriff George Ludlow set off in pursuit of the killer. When he caught up with him, Leblanc was sipping cider in the Mosquito Tavern in the Hackensack Meadows, a pouch of Sayre's possessions by his side. According to his subsequent jail cell confession, Leblanc had stopped to rest en route to New York, where he planned to board a ship bound for Germany. Upon spotting Sheriff Ludlow, Leblanc bolted for the back door of the tavern, but was easily apprehended and transported back to Morristown for prosecution. The trial of Antoine Leblanc for the murders of the Sayre family began in courtroom number 1 of the Morris County Courthouse on August 13, 1833. After being afforded all of the formalities of a fair hearing, a jury took 20 minutes to find the defendant guilty. The next day, Judge Gabriel Ford handed down the sentence. Leblanc was to be hanged by the neck until dead, and then be delivered to Dr. Isaac Canfield, a surgeon, for dissection. On the afternoon of September 6, Leblanc stood atop the modern gallows erected on the village green for the occasion. This new device was designed to jerk the condemned man upward, rather than drop the floor out from beneath him like a conventional gallows. A crowd, estimated at between 10 and 12,000, had descended upon Morristown, greatly outnumbering the local population, which was about 2,500 at the time. The jeering mob, many of whom carried bag lunches, made their way into tall trees and onto nearby rooftops to get a better view of the execution. When the counterweight dropped, Leblanc shot up in the air about 8 feet. His body twitched for about 2 minutes at the end of the rope and then was still. Just over 4 months after first setting foot on American soil, Antoine Leblanc's life was ended. But the truly barbaric story that still haunts Morristown to this day was just about to begin. It seems the good, God-fearing Presbyterian townsfolk were not content to let this murderous scoundrel get off so easy with just a mere hanging. They had some other, more creative ideas of what to do with this monster. First, Leblanc's lifeless body was cut down from the gallows and whisked across the street to Dr. Canfield's office. Then, Doctors Canfield and Joseph Henry conducted some rather unorthodox medical experiments, using Leblanc as their unwitting lab rat. Hooking the corpse up to a primitive battery, the doctors endeavored to prove a prevailing theory of the time, which linked electrical current and muscular motor impulses. Although unable to resurrect the dead man, the scientists reportedly got Leblanc's eyes to roll around in his head, caused his limbs to tense somewhat, and even elicited a slight grin from his dead lips. Frankenstein's monster, though, he was not. After the good doctors had completed their efforts to advance medical science, a death mask likeness of Leblanc's face was cast in plaster. Then it was time to carve him up. Leblanc's skin was peeled off and dispatched to the Atno Tannery on Washington Street to be fashioned into a variety of charming little keepsakes. A large number of wallets, purses, lampshades and book jackets were produced from the hair follicle-studded hide. Strips of skin were sold on the streets, each one personally signed by the Honorable Sheriff Ludlow to verify its authenticity. These gruesome little souvenirs reportedly found their way into many a respectable Morristown home, where, it is said, many still remain to this day. As the years passed, most of the residents of Morristown seemed content to let this dark episode of local justice slip quietly between the pages of the town's history. The story of Antoine Leblanc, however, proved to be harder to kill than the man himself. Rumors concerning the whereabouts of Leblanc's remains continued to circulate around the area long after the 1833 dissection. One such local legend was that Dr. Canfield had reassembled the executed man's skeleton to hang in his office. This myth was disproved, however, in 1893, when workers building an addition to the county clerk's office found Leblanc's missing bones in a small wooden box in the bowels of the old building. Then, on Halloween night 1995, a startling discovery was made which confirmed many of the long-standing rumors concerning the survival of Antoine Leblanc's epidermal artifacts in Morristown. While liquidating the estate of the late Carl Scherzer, workers from Dawson's Auctioneers and appraisers of Morris Plains uncovered the glazed plaster death mask of Antoine Leblanc stashed away in a box in Scherzer's basement. Soon after this grim discovery, a shriveled change purse made from what appeared to be human skin was found tucked away in an upstairs library of the same house. Scherzer, a retired surveyor and unofficial town historian, had evidently amassed quite a collection of 19th-century artifacts during his lifetime. After his death in 1979, the chore of sorting through his museum-like house fell upon the shoulders of his son Douglas, who in turn called Dawson's. The death mask of Antoine Leblanc, along with the skin accessories, were put on display in a glass case at Dawson's, but were not offered for bidding to the packed house at the November 18th auction. After the display was dismantled, the Leblanc trinkets were returned to the custody of the surviving Scherzer. When Weird, New Jersey was invited by Douglas Scherzer, who is the chief of police of Morris Plains, to see the remains of Antoine Leblanc, we jumped at the chance. In his office in the back of the police station, he brought out a cardboard box and laid it on the table before Home State Hintingsus. Folding back the corrugated flaps of the package, he reached inside and unraveled a white towel to reveal the peaceful face of Antoine Leblanc. As if merely sleeping, the delicate plaster eyelids of the death mask closed gently over gracefully intertwining lashes. The pronounced cheekbones sloped down to the broad, smooth lips, which betrayed no expression one way or another. The hollow plaster head seemed to be an almost perfect portrait of the dead man, until you noticed that both ears had been hacked off before the cast was made. Perhaps this was merely a way to ensure the easy removal of the mold from the corpse's head, or maybe the ears were just two more trinkets to be sold on the open market. Affixed to the shaved crown of the eggshell-white cranium was a small paper tag which stated in 19th-century script, "Antoine Leblanc, a Frenchman murdered Judge Sayre and family hanged in Morristown, New Jersey 1833. Then Chief Scherzer removed the remaining contents of the box. He pulled out a dusty old 8x10 picture frame that contained a small rectangular wallet. It was about 4.5 inches long and a sickly greenish-brown in color. It folded over, and a tongue flap fit neatly into a slot on top to close it. I had never seen anything like it before. This was not the tough, yet supple hide of a cow or pig, which we are all familiar with. Nor was it the shiny, rough and scaly skin of a reptile. This was a thin and frail skin that should never have been tooled in such a manner. This skin was cracked and withered. This was the desiccated flesh of a human being. It was an inscription typed on a strip of paper that read, "A wallet made of human skin, allegedly that of Antoine Leblanc." And so, it would seem that reminders of this macabre episode in New Jersey history will continue to find their way into the consciousness of Morristownians. But what has become of the dozens of remaining souvenirs which were culled from the tanned hide of Antoine Leblanc? We don't know. But don't be surprised if you bump elbows with a weird New Jersey reporter the next time you're out canvassing garage sales in the Morristown area. For Antoine Leblanc will undoubtedly rest in pieces scattered throughout that town for some time to come, and an old wallet, once a genuine hide, could turn out to be a real weird find.